Today, we're joined by Dr. Samar Habibullah, a Dubai-based specialist psychiatrist whose clinical approach integrates biological, psychological, and lifestyle interventions. Alongside medical treatment, she incorporates evidence-based guidance on sleep, nutrition, physical activity, stress management, and daily routines, supporting a holistic, sustainable approach to mental health and well-being. Summer, let's dive right into it. Your work has moved through some of the most intensive parts of psychiatry, from acute care through addiction, trauma, families in crisis, and now lifestyle sits at the core of your practice. What pulled you into this field in the first place, and was there a defining moment, or did it just happen with time?
Such a great question. In fact, it was sort of a slow pull rather than a single defining moment. I was drawn to the opportunity and complexity of how the human mind works quite early on, particularly in my early school days when I was my friend's group unpaid therapist. And the idea that the same event could devastate one person and
Mm-hmm.
barely touch another was quite baffling to me. I moved on after school to, start my path and journey towards becoming a clinician. And while I
Mm-hmm.
was seeing patients there through my medical rotations, what I did notice is patients in acute settings, watching them and seeing how little the system was actually designed to understand them. So what
Mm-hmm.
we were essentially doing is managing symptoms, but not people. And that gap between what psychiatry could be and what it often was is what kept me in it and then eventually pushed me towards a more integrative way of working.
Okay. I did not know you were the person in the friend group who was sort of there for people in high school. I would have so enlisted those services back then. For someone who's only known the traditional model, what does the
Yeah.
holistic approach look like?
So traditional psychiatry is largely a diagnosis and medication model. You come in, you
Mm-hmm.
describe symptoms, and you leave with a prescription. That's not wrong. Medication genuinely is life-changing for a lot of people, if and when they
Mm-hmm.
need it, but it is very incomplete. So holistic psychiatry actually asks what's driving those symptoms. So is it sleep, nutrition, stress load, hormonal shifts, trauma, gut health, relationships? All of these are neurobiological. So they change the brain chemistry in measurable ways. In my practice, a treatment plan might include medication, often as a last resort, but it also might include dietary changes, sleep work, movement, neurostimulation, therapy. We're not just treating a diagnosis, we're treating a person's entire system.
Okay, that's such a fascinating way of working through it. Take us through a first appointment with you, because personally, I know I was in that waiting room in my head for a very long time before I finally decided to go for therapy. I'm not sure why. I was a bit afraid, a bit nervous. I just didn't know what to expect. So take us through what actually happens on the other side of the door.
So your experience is not singular. It's very natural to feel that way. The
Mm-hmm.
biggest thing people get wrong is that they'll be judged or that opening the door means something is seriously wrong with them. So the first session is actually just mostly listening on my part. I want to understand your timeline. So not just your symptoms, but your actual life. So when did
Mm-hmm.
things start to shift? What changed? What does a good day look like for you versus a hard one? I also ask about sleep, exercise, relationships, things patients often don't expect a psychiatrist to ask about. Maybe a psychologist, but not necessarily a psychiatrist because it has more of a medical connotation to it. So
Mm-hmm.
by the end of that first hour, most people often say that they feel lighter just from being genuinely heard. And that is the starting point. And that is what oftentimes gets them to come back because we're quite quick to book in an appointment for our hair, for our nails, to the dentist. But very rarely do we book maintenance or check-in sessions when it comes to our mind.
So true, yeah. I know I like felt much lighter just in my body and my mind. But what does a person look like a year later?
Sure. So the most visible shift is in accountability and taking responsibility. So people often come in feeling like things are happening to them. So their mood, their sleep, their anxiety, they're subject to all of that. A year on, they understand their own patterns and they're able to take responsibility for what is in their control. So they know their triggers, their early warning signs, what helps them regulate. They're no longer dependent on a clinician to manage their well-being. They have a framework that's theirs that they know works. And the other thing that I notice is how they talk about themselves. So there's less shame, less catastrophizing. There's a kind of quiet confidence that comes from actually understanding your mind. And that takes some time, but once you get there, it's very liberating.
Gut-brain conversation is everywhere right now. How much of mental health is actually linked to our diet?
So it's very real. The gut produces about 90% of the body's serotonin, which is our feel-good chemical. And there's a nerve called the vagus nerve directly connecting the gut and the brain. So chronic inflammation of the gut correlates meaningfully with depression and anxiety. There's a plethora of research conducted on this as well. So the science is there. And what the conversation often gets wrong is the direction of it, because people hear gut health and immediately think probiotics, supplements, but little do they think of ultra-processed food, alcohol, chronic stress, poor sleep. All of these are destroying the gut environment first. So we can't supplement our way out of a lifestyle that's constantly causing damage. You first have to remove the insults before you can actually repair. So really digging deep and starting from scratch rather than just approaching it from the top.
And for someone who doesn't want to overhaul their diet, where would they start? Preferably without a nutritionist or a meal plan.
Sure. So the first and easiest step that one can actually start to do from tomorrow itself is just removing ultra-processed food from breakfast. Only breakfast. So it's usually the meal that we have some kind of control over. Most of us are home in the mornings, and blood sugar stability in the morning genuinely affects your mood and focus for the rest of the day. So it really sets the tone for the day. You're not meal prepping. You're not counting calories or anything like that. You're just having basic food. Let's say eggs, oats, yogurt, instead of something that comes out of a packet or is super processed. So that single change consistently gives people a tangible felt difference within a few weeks. So that's where I would recommend someone to start.
Okay. And could you give us an example of what your breakfast plate looks like?
So I love eggs, boils, scrambled, omelets. I'm usually having some form of egg a couple of times a week. I really do like overnight oats as well. They're super easy to make. I just pop in some oats in almond milk because I'm lactose intolerant. And in the morning it's ready. I just top it up with some honey and berries. So I am a big foodie. So I try to keep it varied so I don't get bored as well.
Nice. And what about for people who are at work? What's your typical lunch like?
So I do salads during the day. If you're asking about me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So salads during the day, just because it's quick, it doesn't really require much prepping, no heating or anything like that. And it's hard for me to squeeze in a meal between patients, but at least if I know I've got a salad topped with some kind of protein, which is usually, chicken or salmon and a quick dressing on top. So that's my usual go-to.
Okay, lovely. On the topic of sleep,
Yeah.
some of us experience days or weeks of sleep disruption, leaving us irritable or fatigued. What's actually happening? What does the brain lose when sleep falls apart?
So sleep is super, super, super important. It is when the brain does all of its maintenance work. So there's a system called the glymphatic system. And what it essentially does is flush out metabolic waste, including, for example, some proteins that are linked to Alzheimer's or memory issues in elderly. And this glymphatic system is almost entirely active during deep sleep, particularly. So beyond that, sleep is also where emotional memories are processed and consolidated. So when you lose sleep, the amygdala, or also called the threat detection center of your brain, that becomes hyperreactive. So if you haven't slept well, then you're more emotionally volatile, you're more anxious, you're less able to assess risk accurately for the day. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that keeps the amygdala in check, also sort of goes offline when you haven't slept well. So you're not just tired if you haven't slept well, you're also neurologically primed for a bad day.
Okay. And how much of that is actually a sleep disorder versus anxiety, hormones, trauma, or maybe even grief?
Yeah, very interesting that you asked that, because rarely is it purely a sleep problem. In my clinical experience, True primary insomnia, which means essentially just a sleep problem not linked to anything else, is actually quite uncommon. Most of the time, there's an anxiety component, a hormonal component, or an unprocessed emotional load. Women in their perimenopausal period, for example, they are a perfect example. They're often told they have insomnia, but what they have is hormonal change. They have their progesterone dropping and cortisol spiking overnight, and therefore they're unable to sleep well. Also, grief disrupts sleep architecture in very specific ways. Trauma does too. The nervous system can't downregulate enough to move into deep sleep in these situations. And therefore, one of the first questions that I ask patients isn't how do I help you sleep, but it's actually what is keeping your nervous system awake rather. So we dig into that aspect of it.
Okay, very interesting. And do people always have the answers for that? Do they know?
It often requires a little bit of detective work. So we really have to unpack their day, unpack the last few weeks, the last few months. Eventually we do get the answers, and it's super important to get the answers because that's how we know we're truly treating the sleep problem rather than it just being a temporary band-aid.
Yeah, fix the root. All heard exercise is good for mental health, but
Yeah.
how do you prescribe movement differently than for anxiety, depression, and burnout?
Yeah. So we often hear about how exercise is really good for your mental health, but it's not a one size fits all. For anxiety, for example, the goal is nervous system regulation, and that means lower intensity, rhythmic movement, things like walking, swimming, yoga, anything where you can breathe through it. High intensity training, HIIT workouts, can actually spike cortisol further in anxious patients and make them feel worse. So exercise isn't always a good thing. Not all types of exercise for all people. For depression, for example, what you need is moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise, at least 30 minutes of it 2 to 3 times a week. So not necessarily gentle. We need it to move the needle biochemically. So a little bit more intense. The more intense, actually, the better. For burnout,
Okay.
I'm always prescribing less for them, so not more. So people in burnout often exercise compulsively as a form of control. That's what we found.
Yeah.
But the prescription is rest, restoration, parasympathetic activation, again, through things like restorative yoga, walking in nature, nothing with much of a performance metric attached to it.
I've definitely seen when I've burnt out, or even friends, we're immediately at the gym thinking that's just gonna boost our energy levels and give us the sort of dopamine hit that we need. So interesting that you say that, because yoga does relax. On a Sunday, that's the perfect way to unwind and set myself up
100%.
for the week ahead. A lot of this work also asks for time from people that they may not have. This could be parents, carers, folks in the corporate world, anyone whose time really belongs to other people. So what does this version of holistic care look like for
Looks like integration rather than addition. So I'm not asking a parent of 3 or a CEO to find 2 extra hours a day. I know that's really hard. I live a fast-paced life as well, so I completely understand. What I'm asking though is, what's already in your day that we can make therapeutic? Your commute to work could be a breathwork practice, for example. Your lunch break could be 10 minutes outside. Your morning routine could include a protein forward breakfast instead of coffee and an empty stomach. So the frame shifts from I need to find time for wellness to wellness is happening inside the life I already have.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. That's definitely a better way of integrating the practice into your day. For the viewer who's listened to all of this and thought this is the version of healthcare I've been looking for, what can they start doing this week or before they book a session?
Things. One, write down what a 10 out of 10 day looks and feels like for you. Not perfect, just genuinely good. Most people have never articulated it. So really digging deep and figuring out what would make you feel like you've had the best day ever and then trying to incorporate that. 2, track your sleep for 7 days. Just note the time you go to bed, when you wake up, how you feel in the morning. You'll start seeing your own patterns immediately. 3, notice what you eat for breakfast and how you feel mentally 2 hours later. So you're not really diagnosing yourself. You're just starting to pay more attention, and awareness is always the first intervention. The rest is a lot easier once we know what we're working with.
Okay. Those are some really interesting tips. I definitely think people will be more better placed coming into a session, just knowing where they stand.
Mhm.
Yeah. And is there anything that you think or you wish patients asked you more often?
I wish I'd get asked if what they're feeling is normal. People carry so much in silence because they assume no one else feels the way they do. And almost every time when I tell them how common their experience is, the 3 a.m. spirals, the emotional numbness, the guilt about not being happier despite having it all, the relief on their face when they hear that is so very visible. I just wish they would ask earlier. And normalizing something doesn't diminish it. It's important to note that. It just removes the shame that's associated with it, which is purely linked to taboo and societal constraints.
So true. That's so interesting that you said that because my first takeaway from therapy was this is so normal. I've been in my head about this, driving myself to extreme levels of insanity for months to only find out that this is so normal.
Absolutely.
We always end every interview with what's your wellness better recipe?
So sleep is non-negotiable for me. I protect my wind down time the way I'd protect a clinical appointment. Morning sunlight, even just 10 minutes, a walk without headphones a few times a week. That's my thinking time and my processing time. Real food, like real homemade cooked food, as simple as possible. Connection. So I also run a community called Heart to Heart, which is a women's mental health space. It's something that I started as wanting to give back to other women, but honestly, it's become something deeply restorative for me as well. I'd say that the rituals that ground me are mostly unglamorous. It's less about the perfect routine and more about returning to the basics when things get really noisy for me. And those
Yeah.
basics are what bring me back to myself.
Lovely. I love that. And I love that you're doing so much for women's health in the UAE, in the Middle East. It honestly means a lot. And it's one of the reasons why I started Wellness Better as well, and why I've decided to have these interviews with experts like you. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. And anything that we can do to raise awareness and just get people talking about mental health more.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Summer.
It was
And
a pleasure.
we will catch up soon.
Yeah, for sure.